Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Friss, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in. And also, please pardon me for a bit of laryngitis this morning. It's the cold and flu season. And I'm being attacked by these viri that are trying to invade my body and turn me into an invalid. So I'm up and at 'em this morning and doing the best I can, but struggling to keep my voice together, but I'll do the best I can. We're going to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, if my voice will hold out. And we're going to continue just a previous paragraph previous to where we ended yesterday on the program. We're talking about the time in English history where the papacy overthrew the kingdom of England. The king at that time was John, and for all intents and purposes replaced a lawful government with an ecclesiastical government. For a time the Pope was the king of England, and I assert that that is what the papacy is attempting to do on a global scale right now. Out of order, out of chaos, and the end justifies the means, the Pope employing both of these maxims during the overthrow of the government under King John. Anyway, if you're following along, page 448 at the top of the page, page 448, it says, by the imperial law it has been provided that if one of two litigant parties prefer the judgment of the Apostolic See, that is the Vatican, to that of the civil magistrate, the other shall be bound to submit to such judgment. But if we mention this, it's not that we found our jurisdiction on any civil authority. Okay, hang on a second. This is going to be difficult, but I'll continue anyway. In other words, if two litigant parties decide that they want their case heard by the Apostolic See instead of the civil government or the civil judges, then the other party is bound to that judgment. And the Pope continues, but if we mention this, it is not that we found our jurisdiction on any civil authority. Now, the papacy, will never show as the basis of its authority any mere civil government. The papacy claims that it gets its power in the world from God Almighty and no one else. Okay, so he says, He says, God has made it our duty, that is the Pope's, the duty of the popes, to reprehend the man who falls into mortal sin. And if he neglect our reprehension, to compel him to amend by ecclesiastical censures. The Pope may force or compel a man to amend his ways by imposing ecclesiastical censures. Now, moreover, both kings have sworn to observe the late treaty of peace, and yet Philip has broken that treaty. The cognizance of perjury, that is, breaking a treaty or breaking an oath, is universally allowed to belong to the ecclesiastical courts. On this account, therefore, we have also a right to call the parties before our tribunal, unquote. So the papacy is claiming jurisdiction over this matter. How convenient, isn't it, that the Pope can claim jurisdiction whenever he sees fit. Now, and soon after, says R.W. Thompson, in explanation of the Bull of Innocent releasing the English people from their allegiance, Lingard says, quote, Innocent grounded his temporal pretensions on the right which he possessed of judging of sin, and of the obligation of oaths. At first, indeed, the popes contented themselves with spiritual censures, but in an age when all notions of justice were remodeled after the feudal jurisprudence, it was soon admitted that princes, by their disobedience, became traitors to God, that as traitors they ought to forfeit their kingdoms, the fees which they held of God, that is, their kingdoms, and that to pronounce such sentence belonged to the pontiff, the vicegerent of Christ upon the earth. By these means the servant of the servants of God, that is, the Pope, became the sovereign of the sovereigns, and assumed the right of judging them in his court, and of transferring their crowns as he thought just. The King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, that is the prerogative, the principle, and the claim of the papacy, to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And don't miss this. He is a counterfeit of the true. And he bases all of these prerogatives not on the laws of God, but on the laws of God as he defines them. And they are defined in Roman Catholic canon law, which is an obvious forgery. There is no basis for any authority of the Pope, no legitimate basis for the authority of the Pope, temporal or spiritual, anywhere on the earth. Now, the author continues, now, if the reader will examine the first of these extracts, wherein Lingard quotes the language of Pope Innocent, he will see that the latter derives his extraordinary power from the Gratian decretals. All right? Here's the weakest foundation of the papacy. These Gratian decretals, which are just forgeries and falsities, just as ridiculous and disprovable as all of the other pseudo-Isidorian decretals and the other decretals that have been added before and since. Lingard quotes the language of Innocent. He will see that the latter derives his extraordinary power from the Gratian decretals, which, as we've already seen, were made up of numerous gross and palpable forgeries. And if he will then take the pains to examine any of the recent encyclicals of Pope Pius IX, remember he's using all these examples of history to demonstrate the authority that the current Pope at the time of the writing of this book, Pope Pius IX, was using the same foundation for his authority and the justification for his encyclical and syllabus of error, condemning the whole rebellious world for throwing off the authority of the papacy. Okay, Pope Pius IX, especially that of 1864, he will also see that the latter derives his temporal power, which enables him to require obedience of governments as well as individuals, just as Innocent III did, from his divine authority to judge of sin, and therefore from the same false decretals. So all the popes stand on this same shifting foundation, this same dubious, false, forged foundation. Roman Catholic canon law, these false decretals of the popes, assuming that when a pope speaks ex cathedra and makes one of these decrees, that he speaks with infallibility, that it's as though the voice came from God. And it's just, well, there's no other way to describe it than indescribable how the world still, and the kings of the earth still, kowtow to the Pope. He continues, when he talked in the encyclical of 1864, we're talking about the syllabus of error, about having derived from his quote-unquote predecessors jurisdiction over, quote, all heresies and errors which are hostile to moral honesty and to the eternal salvation of mankind, unquote, it was manifestly his intention to place himself above the ground occupied by Pope Innocent. And it is equally manifest that the late Lateran Council, that is the First Vatican Council of 1870, that declared Pope Pius IX infallible, intended to affirm his claim of universal jurisdiction over both faith and morals. That is, over all the sins committed by governments or individuals by acting, by enacting the decree of infallibility. It is a common boast of the papal writers that the faith and teachings of the Roman Catholic Church are immutable. In other words, they never change. That they have always been from the beginning precisely the same. Has not Pope Pius IX then, and will not his successor have, according to its teachings, exactly the same power to judge of sin wheresoever it exists that Innocent III had? Everything now done and said by Pope Pius IX and his ultramontane allies, now here's a reference to the Jesuits. Pardon me, listeners, I'm still having trouble. Anyway, everything now done and said by Pope Pius IX and his ultramontane allies, his Jesuits, is confirmatory of the fact that they so understand the character of the papal jurisdiction. But this question, the greatest of the present age, is susceptible of a more practical test. Alexander II, at the direction of Hildebrand, remember he was the power behind the power at the Vatican. We've been talking about Alexander II all the time, but we were given to understand that it was the future Pope Gregory VII who was holding Pope Alexander II's hand. And everything that we've covered in this chapter, you can see Hildebrand standing in the background. He had not yet become Pope, but he was a cardinal. And he was ruling the roost at the Vatican. And I use those terms advisedly as well. Anyway, Alexander II, at the dictation of Hildebrand, took jurisdiction over the political affairs of England and gave away its crown to William of Normandy because Harold had violated his oath. Okay, there's papal jurisdiction right there, perjury. Thereby committing a sin. Okay, that too is the jurisdiction of the Pope. And it says Pope Pius IX has declared in almost every variety of expression, listen to this now, that Protestantism is a sin and that all the advancing nations and peoples are acting in violation of God's law. Now do you see what the motivation of the Syllabus of Error of 1864 was? It was an attack on Protestantism, that Protestantism was a heresy, that it was a sin, and it was a sin practiced by all of the advancing nations and peoples in violation of God's law. And what is God's law according to the papacy? Everybody repeat after me. Roman Catholic canon law. The pseudo-Isidorian decretals. Falsehoods, lies, and forgeries. It says, Pope Pius IX has declared in almost every variety of expression that Protestantism is a sin, and that all the advancing nations and peoples are acting in violation of God's law. Why may he not, therefore, arraign them on the bar of the Roman Curia, pronounce judgment against them, and dispose them as the interests of the Church shall require? Good question, isn't it? Now we might think, well, what form would that disposition take place? Well, all we have to do is look at the example that the popes used on England. Completely overthrew the government, turned it into an ecclesiastical government. And I assert that that's exactly what they're trying to do here in the United States of America. And as counterproductive as it might seem to argue against a declaration that this is a Christian nation, I want my listeners to realize to be careful When you hear people insisting that America is a Christian nation, make sure that they're not using the word Christian to represent Roman Catholicism, okay? Because they're not the same. They're antithesis of one another. Now, it says, Innocent III declared that he did not derive his jurisdiction over nations from any civil authority. And Pope Pius IX has done the very same thing. They both assert the divine right to comprehend sin and to compel amendment by ecclesiastical censures. All this is of the faith and of the morals, and therefore what they have said is to be taken as said ex cathedra. In other words, from the throne, as if it were God speaking. Innocent III was as infallible when he released the English people from their allegiance and declared that another king than John should be selected, quote, by the authority of the Apostolic See, unquote, as Pope Pius IX now is when he commands the faithful of Germany, Switzerland, and Brazil to resist the laws of their respective governments and calls such resistance the true service of God. So here we have in the encyclical of 1864, the papacy upsetting the governments of Germany, Switzerland, and Brazil, calling the people to resist those governments, doing on a limited scale what he did in England. Remember, England was a precedent-setting circumstance for the papacy. Now, therefore, the penalty for disobedience to papal command must be the same in each case. For the Church, that is, the Pope, judges for herself what she shall do, how she shall do it, and in what manner of refusal to obey her shall be punished. Innocent III made those who disobeyed him, quote, traitors to God, unquote. Are not those who disobey Pope Pius IX precisely the same? Innocent III declared that, quote, they ought to forfeit their kingdoms, unquote, because they, quote, held of God, unquote, against whom they committed the treason, and, quote, that to pronounce such sentence belonged to the pontiff, the vicegerent of Christ upon the earth, unquote, who was, quote, the sovereign of the sovereigns, unquote, and had, quote, the right to judge them in his court and of transferring their crowns as he thought just, unquote. If one of the greatest of the popes has any authority in fixing the law of the Church, then this is as much its law today as it was when it was decreed at the Vatican. And that Pope Pius IX and all his Jesuit supporters so understand it will not be questioned by any who will take the pains to examine the facts. It would require a volume even to compile, without comment, what has been written on these subjects. The Catholic World says, quote, while the state has some rights, she has them only in virtue and by permission of the superior authority, and that authority can only be expressed through the Church. That is, through the organic law infallibly announced and unchangeably asserted, regardless of temporal circumstances, unquote. The Catholic World. Roman Catholic publication. You want to see how our government operates? Just read a Roman Catholic publication. Now, Dr. Brownson, we've talked about him before. Dr. Brownson says, quote, no civil government, be it a monarchy, an aristocracy, a democracy, or any possible combination of any two or all of them, can be a wise, just, efficient, or durable government governing for the good of the community without the Catholic Church. And without the papacy, there is and can be no Catholic Church, unquote. It's rather poignant, isn't it? No government is valid unless it is controlled by the Pope. Now then, as an argument to enforce the proposition that, quote, human laws repugnant to the divine law have no force whatever and are on no account to be obeyed, unquote, he proceeds to say, quote, now as all laws, as all rights, are spiritual or divine, and as all their vigor as laws is derived from the spiritual order, only a spiritual court or representative of the divine order is competent to judge of them, define, declare, and apply them to the practical questions as they come up in individual or social life. Again, my apologies. Now, this representative of the divine order on earth is the church, instituted by God himself to maintain his law in the government of men and nations. Hence the necessity of the union of church and state, and the condemnation in the syllabus of error of those who demand their separation and the independence of the state, unquote. So the essential message in every pope's encyclicals, including that of Pope Pius IX, his encyclical and syllabus of error, is no government is legitimate unless it's united with the church, and the church is supreme over the civil power. Union of church and state. No separation of church and state. No separation clause. No constitution that authorizes the separation of church and state. Now, that's a direct attack upon our Constitution. By anybody's assessment, that is what that asserts. No separation of church and state. Now, he says, moreover, that the state, quote, is bound to protect, unquote, the rights of the church, quote, with physical force if necessary, unquote, and, quote, to govern in accordance with the divine law as she interprets it, declares it, and applies it, unquote. Also that the church has, quote, the right to call upon, unquote, a Catholic state to suppress an insurgent heresy or schism, and to compel those who have personally received the faith to return to the unity from which they have broken away, unquote. So in other words, the Pope can raise up a foreign army to invade a rebellious country and make it by force reunite with the church. Come back under the church's control and authority and obey the Pope. Now, it is through that concept that we need to re-examine history and look at all the wars of the world. Certainly in our examples that we've been given so far in this book by by R.W. Thompson, the Pope was the cause of all the warring uprisings. It has everything to do with religion. It has nothing to do with the gospel. It has everything to do with Antichrist, the Pope of Rome, and has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus Christ. Wars, wars, and rumors of wars, and they'll continue until this Antichrist government that now rules over the kings of the earth will be replaced by a truly benevolent government by Jesus Christ himself. Pope Pius IX, this Antichrist that ruled the world in 1864, wrote his syllabus of error, condemning all of the republics and all the forms of government that rose up out of the Protestant Reformation after having thrown off the chains of oppression of the papacy. He says, moreover, this is Pope Pius IX speaking as if he were God. He says, moreover, that the state is bound to protect the rights of the church. And don't be mistaken, he says, it is the state's responsibility to protect the rights of the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, that makes Roman Catholicism the nationally sanctioned religion of every nation. Okay? And it puts the armies of every nation in defense of that church. Every government and every military of that government should be used to protect the rights of the Roman Catholic Church. That's a state-sponsored church. Okay, we're talking about the union of church and state. The two are bound together by a scarlet cord and cannot be separated unless there be shedding of blood. Okay, and the church rules over the state. The state is a vassal of the church, just like England was made to be a vassal of the Pope. And the church may use physical force if necessary, and to govern in accordance with the divine law as she alone interprets, declares, and applies it. Okay? Physical force is the defining characteristic of this state-sponsored Roman Catholic Church throughout the world. If you want to know who causes the wars of the world, simply read the papal encyclicals. Simply understand that wars do not happen by happenstance, not as a result of circumstances, but they are orchestrated, and they are all for the purpose of extending the papal power, both spiritual and temporal, over the world. And in every war, you'll see the Vatican's hand. Now, also, that the Roman Catholic Church has, quote, the right to call upon a Roman Catholic state to suppress an insurgent heresy or schism. First of all, you must understand that the Roman Catholic Church is the only one qualified to define and identify a heresy and a schism. And once she defines you as a heresy or a schism, she can call a Roman Catholic nation, a Roman Catholic state, or a Roman Catholic entity to suppress you by force. Now, I want to just pose an assertion here. You be your own judge. What did we see at Waco? We saw a Roman Catholic state, the government of the United States of America, putting down a heresy and a schism. This was Roman Catholic canon law conducted by the United States government against its own citizenry, much as did England under Pope Alexander II's rule. And it also may compel those who have personally received the faith to return to the unity from which they have broken away, unquote. Now, let me even apply this one to Waco. How could it be said that those at Waco were of the faith, in other words, once of the faith and had fallen into schism? Let me show you how Rome twists that. You see, in the Roman Catholic Church, baptism is a sacrament. And that sacrament is under the sole jurisdiction of the one holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church. And you may call yourself Seventh-day Adventist, you may call yourself Baptist, you may call yourself Lutheran, you may call yourself anything you want. If you are baptized, you have participated in that Roman Catholic rite, and you have, in a sense, entered the faith. But if you leave the faith and are a participant in a sect that does not submit to Roman Catholic papal authority, you have left the faith. And that justified the American government to come in and siege Waco. See how they twist the normal understanding of the words? Now, Innumerable quotations of this kind could be inserted here, but to do so would only be a work of supererogation. It's more satisfactory to go directly to the Vatican, as everything coming from that quarter has upon it the unmistakable stamp of pontifical authority. In 1870, Cardinal Antonelli issued an official communication from Rome directed to the papal nuncio at Paris, wherein he declared that, quote, the maxims and fundamental principles of the Church He declared that, quote, the maxims and fundamental principles of the Church, unquote, were derived from the, quote, pontifical constitutions, and you may understand that to mean Roman Catholic canon law, the decrees of the Pope, and that is, decrees of popes, among which the celebrated bull Unigenitus of Clement XI. And then he says, quote, and in truth, the Church has never intended, nor now intends, to exercise any direct or absolute power over the political rights of the state, having received from God the lofty mission of guiding men, whether individually or congregated in society, to a supernatural end. She has by that very fact the authority and the duty to judge concerning the morality and justice of all acts, internal and external, in relation to their conformity with the natural and the divine law. And as no action, whether it be ordained by a supreme power or be freely elicited by an individual, can be exempt from this character of morality and justice, so it happens that the judgment of the Church, through falling directly on the morality of the acts, indirectly reaches over everything with which that morality is concerned. So on one side of her mouth she says she has no absolute power over the political rights of the state, and then turns around and says that everything is under her jurisdiction. So you got to be real careful when reading this gobbledygook from the papacy. It's better to judge the Roman Catholic Church not by what she says, because she speaks in a language that only she can understand. It's far, far better to judge the Roman Catholic Church based upon what she does. And that's what this book is all about, comparing what she says with what she does. Now, this is distinct enough to convince the most incredulous that it is a fixed and well-known understood law of the Roman Catholic Church that all individuals and societies and nations are within the circle of papal jurisdiction, and that whatsoever they may do not compatible with God's law, as the Pope shall define it, in the whole domain of faith and morals, he has the right to condemn, and does condemn, by virtue of authority derived directly from God. Hence it will be perceived that the law of the Church is today just as it was just what it was announced to be by Innocent III, and that it confers on Pope Pius IX precisely the same authority which he claimed over the crown of England, and with Alexander II exercised when he decided it to belong to William of Normandy. So the Pope still carries the same power today, or at the time of the writing of this book, 1876, Pope Pius IX had the same authority as did Alexander II when he overthrew the government of England. The papacy is never going to give up any power. And every time they write an encyclical, they reiterate that power. Universal power, unquestioning power, exempt from any prosecution. The power over kings and nations and individuals. Kind of sounds like a god, doesn't it? But he's no god. Now, the law being the same, the penalty for disobedience must be the same, for the Church never changes. In any given case of disobedience, whether by an individual or a nation, the act must be necessarily treason against God, as Pope Innocent III declared. The individual for this offense is cut off by the sword of excommunication from all fellowship with the faithful, and the doors of heaven are closed against him. If he be a ruler, his authority to govern is stricken from his hands, and those who owe him obedience by the laws of the state are commanded not to obey him. The nation, not having, like the individual, a corporeal body to be punished or a soul to be damned, forfeits all rights to the exercise of the power out of which its disobedience arose, and becomes thereby subject to the sovereign of the sovereigns, the Pope, to whom God has given authority to pronounce judgment against it in his court, and to transfer it to whomsoever he shall think just, that is, to the faithful, who will bring it into the path of duty. And when all other remedial measures have failed, the Church, says Pope Pius IX, has the right to avail herself of force to compel obedience. So the Pope can rise up against the king. If the king doesn't repent, he can absolve the people of any allegiance to him, overthrow his throne, and the faithful Roman Catholics of every nation then have the prerogative, upon pain of excommunication, to replace that king with a king that will answer to the Pope. Okay? That's how it works. And if that fails, then the Pope has the right to exercise force to compel that whole nation to comply. You suppose the Pope's getting ready to do that here in the United States? Well, you say, well, Tom, there's a lot of Roman Catholics in this country. Yeah, but if you read Roman Catholic canon law and see how Catholics live in this country, you've got to believe he believes they're all heretical, schismatic. They don't appreciate his authority, not the way it's defined in Roman Catholic canon law. They take what they like about the Pope and they spit out what they don't like about the Pope, and the Pope's not going to tolerate that. Could Roman Catholics be trusted to replace this government with one who will bend his knee to the Pope and do as he says? And if not, you must realize that the Pope is considering, or could consider if he thought fit, to completely destroy this nation, just as he did England. Now, we're not left, excuse me, we are not left to any conjecture in reference to the punishment of individuals or nations for the heresy of disobedience to the Pope, which is considered as disobedience to God. If the doctrine laid down by Pope Innocent III and Pope Pius IX is not explicit enough on the subject, it is so laid down by authors of recognized authority who have compiled the law of the Church as to leave no room for question. In 1773, a work was published in Spain written by Alfonso de Castro, a learned friar, which was designed to set forth the law of the Church for the punishment of heretics. This punishment he divides into two classes, spiritual and temporal. The latter are defined to be proscription and confiscation of property and, quote, the deprival of every sort of preeminence, jurisdiction, and government, which they previously exercised over persons of every condition, unquote. To this class belongs kings and those who govern public affairs. Quote, a king, he says, having become a heretic, is ipso jure deprived of his kingdom, a duke of his dukedom, an earl of his earldom, and so with other governors of the people, by whatever name they are known, unquote. And this is done by the Pope, who, quote, derives a king of his deprives a king of his royal dignity and strips him of his kingdom. For in the manner of faith, kings, like other subordinates, are the subjects of the sovereign pontiff, who can punish them as he does others." Unquote. Inasmuch oh, maybe I should have thrown in the towel earlier, but I'll keep going. Inasmuch as to deprive a ruler of his kingdom, the country would be left without a governor unless something more were done. The law goes a step further. This author states it in these words, quote, "If an heretical king has no heir to the throne, and if the heir also be a heretic, then if the nation be not infected with heresy, I should say that it has the power and the right to electing the king. As it is said in the first book of Kings, quote, 'The people makes itself a king,' unquote. But if the people also be infected with the same pestilence or the heresy as the king, the people will be deprived ipso jure of the power of choosing for itself a king, and then the business will devolve to the sovereign pontiff," unquote. And that was the case in England. Because remember, the people were the Anglo-Saxons, weren't they? They didn't appreciate the interference of the Pope. So he overthrew the Anglo-Saxon people too, and he made himself the king of England. And that's the ecclesiastical government that the Pope intends to impose upon the whole world in this new world order. If the king is heretical and has no heir, or his heir is polluted with this heresy, then the people make themselves a king and elect a king to represent them. But if the whole nation is contaminated with a heresy as defined by the papacy, then the whole matter devolves to the papacy for the decision. And thus the remote facts in English history already detailed connect themselves with our own times by the attempt of the papacy under the head of the Jesuits to revive the papal doctrines of the Middle Ages. If you have ever heard me say that the New World Order is simply the Old World Order restored, this is exactly what R.W. Thompson is saying here. He says, and thus the remote facts in English history, which we've been covering, already detailed, connect themselves with our own times by the attempt of the papacy under the head of the Jesuits to revive the papal doctrines of the Middle Ages as the means of arresting the progress and advancing civilization of the 19th century. We got to arrest the advancement of civilization because civilization began to advance after the Protestant Reformation. We got out of this medieval system where the Pope ruled supreme. We put Christ on the throne, and we became industrious people, having the law written upon our own hearts. We had no need for a pope. We only had need to obey God's law. And then we were able to put all our resources into advancements. But the Pope doesn't like that system. He wants to return to the Middle Ages, the Old World Order. It says the passionate declamation of the Pope and the vaporing of a few hierarchs, or all of them for that matter, amount to nothing in the abstract. Like all others of disappointed ambition, they are most prolific in terms of denunciation against those who have been driven out of the Roman Catholic Church by their severity and injustice. And if they choose to drive them still further by additional severity and injustice and every form of anathema and malediction, Protestants are not likely to concern themselves very much about it. But when they impudently arraign whole nations of people, as Pope Pius IX's encyclical does, deny them the right to govern their own affairs, pronounce judgment against them as heretics and traitors to God, and claim that the Pope has the divine right to set up his own rulers over them, it is quite time for us to understand what is to be the effect of all this upon the future destiny of our own country, the United States of America. But this question can be more satisfactorily considered when we shall have learned something more of the working of the papal system, which we are now asked to adopt in preference to that which has placed us in so eminent a position among the nations. R.W. Thompson wants us to be aware of this history and understand what implications it has for the United States of America. Never mind that it's known as Protestant USA. He wants us to know that Protestantism is and always has been, at least since the Protestant Reformation, has been a target of the Vatican. And this government is a target of the Vatican. And anyone who reads and understands Pope Pius IX's encyclical and syllabus of error of 1864 understands that the finger was pointed directly at the United States as a heretical nation, a nation that divided church and state, threw off the papal yoke, proclaimed rights and liberties for the people, and made the people the governor of their own land, to pick their kings and to hold them account, just as did the Anglo-Saxons. The papacy made an example of those Anglo-Saxons and their English nation and their English king. Don't think for a moment that that's not a prime objective of the current Pope at the Vatican.